part 2, skills not to be performed. I just wanted to remind you, most people, as they start to age, will think about this. You know, do you want to be placed on a ventilator or whatever? I have a living will. I have a medical power of attorney, and it's not a family member. You know, if one of my sisters were my power of attorney and they said, oh, pull the plug, cut off life support, the others will be mad at her. They'll, you know, why did you make that decision? So you always make it a family friend that you entrust with that. Who cares if my sisters are mad at the family friend? So a lot of people live with these out of hospital, do not resuscitate orders, living wills, durable power of attorney, those kind of things. So as we have an aging population, more and more people will go to live with their children. And when they do that, everybody needs to be aware of what that patient's wishes are. The problems arise when the family doesn't agree with their wishes. So if they've called, one of the first things you need to say is, do they have a DNR? And they say no, then you treat them as if they don't have one. You always want to err on the side of treatment rather than withholding treatment until you find that DNR. So this would be a good example of you arrive on scene and that person is no longer breathing, and you start ventilations, and you get on the phone and call your medical director or online medical control and say, hey, we started CPR, whether it be ventilations or compressions, and then the other adult child showed up with a DNR. You can't stop CPR once you start it unless directed by the physician, unless the person recovers, unless you find reasons that, you know, they're not going to be resuscitated. We'll talk about those in a second. But you can't just go, oh, you know what, this isn't working, let's stop. Or the DNR's here. You still have to call and get that. That'd be a good example of online medical control. Definition for abandonment is when a trained professional is treating someone and then leaves that patient before another trained person of equal or higher certification takes over. So if you deliver the patient to the nurse, that's equal or higher. EMS shows up, the paramedics are there, you deliver the patient to equal or higher. Whereas if a paramedic started care and then said, oh, you know what, you're my partner, you can ride in the back and I'll drive on this one, and it's clearly visible they need ALS, and that would be abandonment. They've started something that you can't keep that same scope of care continuing. Person's dead at the scene. These are times that you would not want to start care. Decapitation, where their head is all either completely removed from the body or partially removed. Rigor mortis usually sets in at the joints closest to the head, so the jaw would be the closest one to check. Somebody dies in their sleep, you just take that lower jaw and move it a little bit, and if it doesn't move, that's a sign of rigor mortis. Usually sets in within hours of death, depending on the temperature and the age of the patient, some other things. Tissue decomposition, you can actually smell the body before you get to the scene, especially if you're downwind. You know, we're not going to resuscitate that. And then dependent lividity. If they're laying on their back, the buttocks and the back, the shoulders will be blanched white, but you'll see a pooling of blood in the lower back region. So when you roll them over, you'll see that lividity. It's the blood components separating from the water, and that causes that. The blood starts pooling in the gravity parts. If any signs of death are present, consider the patient to be dead. If it's a crime scene, we do not cover them up with a blanket, because that can inhibit their crime scene evidence collecting. So know what your protocol is in dealing with patients who are found dead on scene. The other part of this is, even if you can't cover them up, you want to protect them, protect the scene from the bystanders and onlookers, and that seems to be a continual thing that we have a problem with if you can't cover the body. Definition for negligence is somebody actually sustains further injury or harm because you didn't meet the standards. And again, most of these are acts of omission rather than commission. Something you should have done that you didn't do, rather than something you shouldn't have done that you did do, or you did do but it was done incorrectly. So a good example of that is that cervical collar or extrication to a backboard, or not putting oxygen on them, or not transporting them or something. So you had a duty to act, it was contractual, you were on call or on shift. Somewhere in there, the standard of care was broken, the scope of care was broken, resulting in a breach of duties. From that, an injury resulted to the patient, and that breach of duty was a proximate cause of that resulting injury. All four of those must be present to prove negligence. Again, if you do what you were taught to do, you do it in the best interest of the patient, you're not going to have a problem. Confidentiality, all patient information is confidential. So it's not only their medical findings, it's that hoarder that lives down the street and the house looks good on the outside and you're like, oh my God, if only you knew. No, we can't share that with people. Somebody tells you, you know, they had 4 abortions and you, oh wow, I did not know that about. Nobody will ever find that out. So all of this is shared only with medical personnel who have a need to know. I've had people call up and like, hey, you transported my brother. I'm like, yeah, ask him. Yeah, I can't release that information to you. You're not part of his care. In certain situations, you may release information. The police may call and say, you know, what was his status as you transported? They want a one word, you know, critical or stable or whatever. Because we're all covered by the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Its acronym is HIPAA. And that allows us, big thing it does is allow us to transport our insurance with us as we change jobs. But can you imagine interviewing for a job and that information that you have, you know, some disease is released and they know, oh, well, this person's going to be out a lot on sick leave, so yeah, we're going to hire the other person instead. Well, this safeguards your patient information. And just a note on this is sometimes we have calls in that hot wash, we're debriefing, you stop at a store, think about the people that are listening to that conversation. You'll never know, you know, what ears will go, wow, I know that person they're talking about. I remember, you know, they just told me about it or something. So be real careful with that. The penalty is over $50,000 now, personally against you, plus up to a year in prison. So you don't want to be the one that releases information other than for treatment, payment, or operations. Those only involved in the direct care of that patient. Good Samaritan law. So you're not always going to be on call. You're not always going to be on shift. And things happen. In Texas, you're protected from being sued. Anybody can be sued, but you're protected from any kind of liability if you provide care in good faith the way you were taught. And it's not like, oh, well, I'm not getting paid for this, I'm not on shift, so all I'm going to do is hand them some gauze. I'm not going to bandage it or splint it. No, you still have to act as if you were on the truck. The biggest thing it does is it keeps you, it allows you to stop and render care without thinking, oh my God, am I going to be sued for this? So just kind of think about that. In Texas, Good Samaritan laws are very effective. Do what's within your scope of care. Do it as another prudent EMR would do. And without expecting, oh, maybe they're going to leave me their car in their will or something should they die. That kind of thing. Regulations, we've talked a little bit about the state ones. The rest are local, and those are going to be based on your service area as you join an EMS. And so you want to make sure that you're abiding for all of those. A big one that I can think of is the texting and driving, or even using your cell phone while you're operating an ambulance. You know, if there's a policy that says that you can't, well, you know, number one, don't. But if there's any little fender bender or anything happens, I guarantee you law enforcement's going to grab that phone and see what you were doing, and then the liability is all on you. So make sure you follow all regulations. There's a list of reportable events, so if you go to a stabbing and they say, no, I just stabbed in the leg, it's no big deal, I don't want to be transported, well, you don't just leave. You have to report that to law enforcement. There's been a crime. Even a dog bite, you know, has to be reported. You know, you look at some of these and go, well, that's a no-brainer, but, you know, why the dog bite? Well, if we have a vicious dog who bites routinely in the neighborhood, we all want to know about it, as well as, you know, having them checked for rabies and other things that could be transmitted. So know what's reportable in your area. That was just a short list. Failure to notify proper authorities of these can result in sanctions against you. So it's suspected child abuse. You go to where a kid, you know, has fallen, and the parents give you this story that just doesn't sound right, and you're like, well, okay, yeah, you know, put some ice on it. I agree, don't need to go to the hospital, but it just doesn't sound right. Any suspicion needs to be reported. Otherwise, failure to notify may result in sanctions against you. Crime scene operations: protect yourself. If you determine the scene is not safe, leave. Your patient is your priority is patient care right after your own scene safety. So think about these. You want to document everything that seems unusual. You make one path into the crime scene, follow that same path out. You don't know how many times people have gotten off that were, suspected of doing things because there was another set of footprints there and they could not match it up to somebody. Move the patient only if necessary. Touch only what you need to gain access to the patient. If you find out that they're dead, you're not going to resuscitate, follow your path back out and wait at a safe distance for law enforcement if you made access into there before they get there. We don't cut through. We cut off a lot of clothes. I was kind of known as the fastest scissors in the West, so you're going to cut off clothes, but don't cut through knife and bullet holes. That has evidence that needs to be preserved. Careful where you place equipment. Number one, that it doesn't get contaminated, but also that you don't affect the evidence that are there. Work with appropriate law enforcement. Give them any information that you can give without violating HIPAA. And always write, it says a short report about the incident. I hate the word short. Just write a report that has everything in there that you can imagine, because if you get called in to testify, you're going to want to have a good picture that you painted from there. So document as much as you can. It's a legal record that maybe in 2 years, somebody brings a suit against another, or it's a crime scene and then you're called in to testify on your part, and you're going to forget things. So make sure that you have all that documentation clear, readily available to you. We file our reports, we save them electronically, so you'll be able to access that. Infectious disease exposures also, there's forms for that. Every service has somebody that they report that to. Hey, this guy coughed in my face, I'm not sure what he has. I wasn't wearing a mask, and now I'm a little bit worried that, I may have contracted something. We report that so we can follow up on testing that patient. So as an EMR, you have a duty to act. It needs to be formal and contractual. If you're off duty and you stop, you have to perform your skills the way you would in any other situation, but you're covered by the Good Samaritan laws. We want to make sure we get consent from our patients. We call that express consent, implied if they're unable to answer. We talked about minors and the fact that minors cannot consent nor refuse. So if you have a minor who says, no, I'm okay, you've got to call a parent before you leave that scene. Need to remember, everybody has a right to refuse care. Patients with advanced directive or out of hospital do not resuscitate. Give that patient the right to have that care withheld. So we want to honor that unless it's vague. Then we want to err on the side of doing something and then call medical control. We want to understand the concepts like abandonment, negligence, confidentiality, as well as Good Samaritan. Understand that people will come with contagious diseases that may or may not show any outward signs or symptoms. So we want to be very careful with airborne, bloodborne, direct, and indirect contact with patients. We always want to be suited up, what we call body substance isolation, or BSI. Little review. Emergency medical responders have the legal duty to act only when they're being compensated by a certified agency. No, we said if you're a volunteer, but you've signed up for a shift, that's still a contract. If you witness an emergency scene while not on duty, you don't have a legal act, you have an ethical, maybe moral act, but not legal. Even when outside their response jurisdiction, legal. Outside your response jurisdiction, not really, right? If they're employed by an agency as EMR. So that is the best answer. That is your contract. You're employed and on shift at that time. Patients are legally able to make a decision regarding their care if they're of legal age. Yes. Have injuries that are not life-threatening. Willingly accept transport to the hospital. Have bystanders who can verify their competency. Bystanders not going to be able to do that. So the biggest thing that we're looking at there, that they're of legal age according to the state law. In Texas is 18. EMRs have the ethical responsibility to provide care only when a paramedic is present. That would be false. Discuss details of each case with coworkers. They're not involved in the care. We don't discuss that. Transport all patients to the closest hospital. Not necessarily, right? Sometimes we go to a specialized hospital, conform to accepted professional standards. That is the best answer.